So we are here tonight to talk about poetry. And I like to start, I mean, we're specifically talking about found poetry, but I like to start this discussion with what poetry is in the first place, because I think it makes a lot of people more comfortable then with the found poetry part of it. So we're going to talk about what poetry is in general and then types of found poetry. So here are some definitions of poetry in general. A literary work in which special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. Another one is writing that formulates a concentrated, imaginative awareness of experience in language chosen and arranged to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, and rhythm. And the third, the art of rhythmical composition, written or spoken, for exciting pleasure by beauty, imaginative, or elevated thoughts, beautiful thoughts. And so what I like to point out here is that there's some commonalities among these three definitions. I'm sure there's more definitions out there too. But the first is literary work, writing, composition, written or spoken. So clearly this is a literary thing, a writing, or speaking element or artistic form of expression, if you will. And the next thing is each of these also have feelings, emotion, or that poetry is supposed to excite, exciting pleasure. So it has to do with feelings and emotions. And then the third that all three of these have in common is rhythm, rhythmical. So there does need to be a rhythm or a pattern to poetry. And so just to sum up what these common themes are, as we just said, they're writing or reading. It's that sort of literary form, literary or artistic form. It deals with feelings and emotions, whether it's you're expressing them or you're trying to heighten them in others, and that there is a rhythm or a pattern. And so the one thing that I want everyone to notice about these definitions is that there is something that was not common among them, and that is rhyme. Poems do not have to rhyme. And I would say the majority of found poetry especially does not rhyme, at least what I have seen. I think I just read one that they made it work. They did make it rhyme, but it was like one out of all that I've ever seen. So then to get on to found poetry specifically, what we're here to do tonight, here are some definitions of found poetry. It's a type of poetry created by taking words, phrases, and sometimes whole passages from other sources and reframing them as poetry by making changes in spacing and lines or by adding or deleting text, thus imparting new meaning. The next one is a composition made by combining fragments of such printed materials as newspapers, signs, or menus and rearranging them into the form of a poem. And something when I was doing more research for this program recently that in looking at definitions of found poetry is that while this points out like newspapers, signs, menus, it's very often not poetry that is used to make found poems, which I think is especially interesting because you're taking something that would not be considered poetic at all and making it into a poem. And then I think my favorite definition of found poetry is it's the literary equivalent of a collage. Because again, you're taking these pieces from either from one work or from different works and combining them together. And some of it is literally collage, as in we're taking pieces, parts, and gluing them onto paper to make new poetry. So next up are some of the types of found poetry. These are kind of like the main five that I kept seeing or something similar to this list when I was doing research for this. So there's cut up, erasure, blackout, freeform excerpting and rewriting, and then cento or cento. I've heard it pronounced both ways. So I think it's kind of up to the speaker. So I'm probably going to say cento because that's what it was in my head before I heard other people say cento. So to go into more detail about each of these, Found poetry that is cut up this is sometimes also called collage, but it's commonly thought of as the ransom note of poetry. Poets physically cut or tear up a text into words and phrases, then create a poem by rearranging those strips or pieces. The arrangements of words and phrases may be intentional or haphazard. So you could just literally rip stuff up, kind of shake it up, throw it at the table, see what you get, or you can very purposefully sit there and arrange them. I'm more about the purposely sitting there and arranging them. So this next slide are some examples of cut up poetry. These are ones I found on the internet. These are not ones that I created, but I do have one later that I created if we need to look at that. And so again, these are just some examples of cut up or collage, or again, these look like ransom note. I especially think the one with the ripped edges looks especially ransom note. So, okay. Next one is erasure. And this is poets take an existing source, usually limited to one or a few pages, and erase the majority of the text, leaving behind select words and phrases that, when read in order, compose a poem. So it's quite literally erasing words, and what's left is what makes up the poem. And so here's some examples of erasure. There's another one. Okay. And next type is blackout poetry. This is where poets take markers, usually black permanent markers. It's kind of like the hallmark of blackout poetry, to an already established text and redact words until a poem is formed. And then the text and the redacted text form a sort of visual poem that draw your eyes across the page. And so here's some examples. I'm going to try to hide I'm not sure if you guys can see it, but hide some, because I do like this fungus poem. It is a good one. Yeah, so as you can see here, these are just, it's scribbled out where what they don't want you to read, and then the rest is still there for you to read. And then these are some examples of some more, like, they're more artfully done found poetry, where, again, they're still only using specific words, but the rest is redacted, if you will, but using art. So that is another form of, like, I consider that blackout poetry still. So the fourth kind is of found poetry is freeform excerpting and remixing. Poets excerpt words and phrases from their source text and rearrange them in any manner they choose. The best way that I found to think about this one, other than all of it is somewhat like this, is these blackout poetry, like with a twist. And so these are blackout, like stuff is redacted, but it is having you read it in a certain order, as opposed to, like, on normal blackout, you're just reading as you would left to right, top to bottom. These take you in different ways on purpose. So there is that. And then the last one that we're going to talk about tonight, at least, is the cento, which the word cento is derived from the Latin word for patchwork. And here it's poets unite lines from other authors' writings into a new poem. The original lines remain intact. The main intervention comes in the arrangement and form. A common one, and one that I love to do, especially with other, as a program at the library, but it's hard to do right now with COVID, is bookspine poetry. And that's where you find books that the titles make a poem, and you stack them up and you take a photo. And so these are ones I found online, but I do have some bookspine poetry that I've created in the past. It's really fun, especially it's fun. It's one of those two where it's interesting sometimes that the books are on the shelf that way. They just so happen to fall that way, and they're not by the same author, and yet they make an interesting little poem. So there's that. And then this is the These are references that I used to, create this PowerPoint and whatever, I've had it for a while. I didn't edit it though, but Wikipedia, thoughtco.com, writersdigest.com, some web pages associated with the Academy of American Poets, and as well as web pages associated with the Found Poetry Review, which is now defunct. The Found Poetry Review no longer publishes or takes in new work, but the website is still there. So you can still get good info off of it. And so with